Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. The festive season is upon us, and for many people, it's time to rest, go on holiday, see family and friends, share gifts, and de-stress from the year. But for others, this time of year is filled with sadness, substance abuse, violence, and even financial ruin, which often culminates in depression and sometimes even suicide. To help us cope with some of these, we're joined by Vuyo Temba, who's a clinical psychologist. Vuyo, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome to Newzroom Afrika. I mean, one would think that the festive period is really all about the cheer and reflecting positively on the year. But for some, it's a really, really difficult time. How does one cope during such a time where you could be encountering family members who may be asking you for money, asking you to buy them a drink, and that in itself ends up translating to something completely different in your mind?
Hi, Paul, and good morning to all the viewers. It is a difficult time for other people. I think, when you're blessed to enjoy the community and the love of family, we always assume that it's like that for everybody. But I think more importantly is to first understand why it is that for some people it might not be such a favorable season. I mean, for starters, it's a time that triggers a lot of losses. It's a time that triggers ideals of that we haven't realized, or, ideas of what we thought life would be like, or even the Christmas itself would be like. Also, you find that some people, because of the expectation that during Christmas we should all be happy and we should all be jubilant, the expectation is that then, all of us should be like that. And when somebody doesn't feel as jubilant, they start to feel a sense of shame or a sense of guilt towards that. So if we look at these two categories of people, I think it's important to, in terms of coping, to look at first being open with people that are around you. I mean, for starters, especially for those people who may feel that there's a lot of expectations that have been placed on them by family members, by friends, by colleagues, it's to be able to communicate what it is that they stand for and what this period means for them. It's important to also communicate during this time whatever boundaries that individuals may have, especially when it comes to, like you said, you go home and people start to ask for the 2 randa or whatever there. It's important to also communicate with people what that means for you and how it violates whatever boundaries, things that we're not able to get to. Again, it's important that we communicate those because what causes the biggest stress often is that people are not communicative. And sometimes those who are being who start to communicate may not be taken seriously. And so it's important to communicate your boundaries, reinforce your boundaries, but most importantly, to also take care of yourself, knowing that this time will pass. Because often what happens is that we feel overwhelmed by this period because we're thinking it's not going to pass.
Yeah. And you make mention of stress. Perhaps that brings us into maybe a thorough understanding of the types of mental health trigger points to look at.
Yeah. I mean, the biggest one we know, is that during this time, for many people who've lost loved ones, it will be a time of their fest. Christmas often is associated with spending time together, with being in community with others. And when we think of the fact that those that we wanted to be in community with or in communion with are not with us, it often is triggering. For some people, this period might trigger things from their own past that have not been resolved, whether It's how we used to spend Christmas at home and what it meant for some people. Sometimes Christmas, what brings about the stress also is all the expectations that people lay at our feet, that, because you're coming from the urban areas, or because we know we are to have a certain lifestyle, a certain job. So when you come to Ezlalini, now we look to you, to solve whatever problems that we may have. And those expectations sometimes become overly overwhelming to the point that it starts to then bring up a lot of stress, because we're not able to deal with the demands that have been placed at our feet.
We also just looking at studies that speak about the suicide deaths. They, as I read, it says 11.7% and 9.2% more prevalent in South Africa during the months of December and January. How then does one ensure that they don't, take their own lives, or really just fall into a deep depression, which might trigger some other psychological disorders? What are the telltale signs that one can look out for?
Okay. I think the biggest one is, when we're not feeling well, and what often mental health issues do is that they want to isolate us from people. Often what we want to do is we want to withdraw when we're not feeling well, when we're not in a good space. And to counter this, that's exactly what we need. We need to be able to move towards people and not isolate ourselves. I know it sounds counterintuitive, because when we're not okay, we want to isolate, but that's the time we need people in our lives. Remember, we are wired for socializing as humans. We're wired to be in community and in communion with others. So when we isolate ourselves, it also doesn't help to mitigate the effects of whatever we're going through. Some of the telltale signs that people need to look out for, often I say, when you know somebody and you start to realize that they are acting outside of who you know them to be. So if you know Mpho to be somebody who's very sociable, out there, always wanting to connect with others, and suddenly Mpho is isolating herself, withdrawing from people, feeling sad most of the time, not feeling like she wants to wake up, not feeling like she's interested in anything else outside of whatever she'll be busy with at that point. Activities that used to be meaningful to her, when she suddenly when we say, hey, Mpho, let's do this, and suddenly she says, no, I cannot. So it's looking at those things. But I think the biggest one is around isolating ourselves, because it's when we are isolated that people are also not able to pick up anything that might be able to help us during our period of distress or our period of being alone.
So how you talk about one solution as being able to set boundaries and be really deliberate about that. But what are the other ways to navigate around this?
The other ways that we often look at is, I suppose at this point, one, if we look at, for instance, some of the expectations that are on us, in terms of, let's say, financial expectations, I think what is important here, again, is to be able to plan and make lists for yourself in terms of what it is that you can get to yourself that is outside of other people. Because also sometimes what causes the strain is the fact that we ourselves, it's not other people's demands of us, or people violating our boundaries, but sometimes it's the expectations we have of ourselves in terms of, what we think. So this is when we project in what we think people require of us. So I would say some of the ways to look out or to help ourselves also this time, like I said, remind yourself that it won't last forever. I mean, it's a couple of days. And so in these days, it's saying, how can I find something that is meaningful for me about this period? Okay, so here we might be looking, it's what we often look at and call being mindfully or being present to our experiences. So yes, I might not necessarily feel happy to be here, but maybe I'm grateful to be alive. And so when I focus on my gratitude, I am grateful to have the meal that I'm going to have, even though the relations may not be the greatest. So I would say, as you remind yourself that it's not going to last forever, to start then focusing on some of the things and being grateful for the things that are going well.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I think it's also taking time out, because at times we don't allow ourselves a moment to go, to remove ourselves from the situation, just to revive ourselves and re-energize. But I think it's also important to re-energize, and then we come back, engage, and then when we need time off, we can give ourselves that one.
Vuyo Temba, thank you so much for your time. Clinical psychologist giving some sound advice there.